Most people remember Sophie Kinsella as the author of funny books about shopping.
That description has survived for over 20 years, and it's completely inadequate.
Because those books were never really about shopping.
They were about money anxiety, emotional avoidance, and the strange ways intelligent people convince themselves they're fine when they're not. They were about trying to be a functioning adult in a world that quietly keeps changing the rules.
The reason millions of readers didn't just enjoy these books, but return to them, is not humor. It's recognition. Long before conversations about burnout, emotional labor, or financial shame entered everyday language, Sophie Kinsella was writing characters who lived inside those pressures without having the words for them. Characters who looked functional on the outside and chaotic on the inside. Characters who were not broken, but overwhelmed.
Rebecca Bloomwood, the protagonist of the Shopaholic series, is often remembered as frivolous, impulsive, and irresponsible. But that memory misses the point. Rebecca is highly articulate, emotionally perceptive, and painfully aware of her own contradictions. Her problem is not ignorance, it's avoidance.
And avoidance, when you look closely, is not laziness. It's fear dressed up as optimism.
This is why the books still work. Not because they belong to a particular era, but because they describe a psychological pattern that hasn't gone anywhere. Wanting relief, postponing discomfort, hoping the next choice will quietly fix everything.
What Sophie Kinsella understood, better than most writers of her time, is that many people are not failing at life. They are managing it the only way they know how, with imperfect tools, under constant pressure.
She chose to write about that without cruelty.
That choice shaped everything that followed. What made this approach unusual was not that it was funny, but that it was precise. Sophie Kinsella paid attention to how thoughts actually form under pressure, not the polished version people present to others, but the private negotiations that happen internally, the justifications, the bargains, the momentary relief, followed by delayed consequences. Rebecca Bloomwood doesn't think in slogans. She thinks in spirals. One sensible idea bumps into another, optimism interrupts anxiety, and logic is bent just enough to make a bad decision feel temporarily reasonable. It's funny because it's familiar, and it's familiar because it's human. At the time these books were first published, this kind of interiority was rarely treated with kindness. Women's anxiety, especially around money and competence, was either trivialized or moralized. You were either careless or incapable. There wasn't much space for nuance. Kinsella made space.
She didn't frame her protagonist as someone who needed fixing. She framed her as someone navigating a system that rewarded appearance over stability and optimism over honesty. Rebecca wanted to be good at life. She just didn't know how to do it without panicking a little along the way.
That distinction changes how a story feels. It shifts the reader from judgment to curiosity, from distance to closeness. And closeness is what allows a story to settle in rather than skim the surface. Before we go any further, let's slow things down briefly. Not to drift off, just to reset your attention.
If you're sitting or moving, let your shoulders drop slightly. Take a calm breath in through your nose, easy and unforced. Then let it out through your mouth, as if you're releasing something you don't need to hold right now. One more time, in and out.
That's enough. This is the pace these stories operate at. Alert, but not rushed. Engaged, but not demanding.
Rebecca Bloomwood's world is full of external noise. Work expectations, social pressure, financial reminders she would rather ignore. But the narrative voice never joins that noise. It stays steady, observant, curious. That steadiness is what allows the reader to stay present, even when the character is not.
It's also what makes the books feel safe to return to.
As the series unfolds, nothing spectacular happens. There are no dramatic revelations that suddenly reorganize Rebecca's life. Instead, there are small shifts, lessons half learned, patterns recognized a moment too late, choices that are slightly better than the last ones. This is not a redemption arc. It's an accumulation of experience.
And experience, unlike transformation, doesn't require you to become someone else.
One of the quiet achievements of these books is how they normalize inconsistency. Rebecca can be competent in one area and completely overwhelmed in another. She can be generous, thoughtful, and emotionally intelligent while also being avoidant and impulsive. The story never forces those traits into a hierarchy. They simply coexist. That coexistence reflects real life more accurately than most fiction ever tries to. People are not problems to be solved, they are systems under pressure.
This is why readers didn't just laugh and move on. They stayed. They followed Rebecca across cities, jobs, relationships, and phases of adulthood, not to see her become perfect, but to see how she would cope next.
Coping is the real subject here. And coping looks different depending on who you are and where you're listening from right now. If you're hearing this at home, or on a bus, or while making dinner, you're already doing it. You're already navigating your own version of modern life. If you feel like it, you can leave a comment and say where you're listening from. Not for engagement's sake, but because it's always grounding to remember that people are hearing the same story from many different places, all carrying their own quiet context with them. Sophie Kinsella understood that context mattered, that readers brought their own fatigue, their own anxieties, their own unfinished thoughts into the story. She wrote in a way that made room for that. Her books don't compete with your life. They sit alongside it. That's why they work in motion, on trains, during walks, in moments when your hands are busy, but your mind needs something gentle and intelligent to hold on to. The language never rushes you. The tone never insists. It trusts that you'll stay if it's worth staying for. And that trust is repaid. Because once you notice how carefully these stories are built, you start to see them differently. Not as light distractions, but as quietly skillful observations of how people survive expectation, pressure, and their own inner noise. This is where the story really begins. Not with shopping bags or punchlines, but with attention. Attention to thought patterns, to emotional pacing, and to the fragile balance between wanting more and being overwhelmed by it. What makes the first Shopaholic book quietly radical is not the shopping itself, but the voice behind it. Becky Bloomwood doesn't sound like a heroine. She sounds like a friend whispering excuses to herself at 2 a.m, receipts stuffed in a drawer, promising that next month will be different. From the very beginning, Sophie Kinsella gives us access to Becky's inner monologue, and that inner voice is the real engine of the story. It is anxious, persuasive, defensive, hopeful, and endlessly creative. Becky doesn't simply want things. She negotiates with herself about them. She rationalizes, delays guilt, reframes mistakes as future wins, and in doing so, she mirrors something deeply human. The brilliance of the secret dream world of a shopaholic lies in how recognizable this internal logic is. Becky works as a financial journalist, a deliciously ironic choice, surrounded by advice she cannot follow. She knows the rules. She understands interest rates, debt, and budgeting. Knowledge is not her problem. Emotion is. Kinsella understands that money, especially for women, is rarely just about numbers. It is about identity, belonging, self-worth, and fantasy. Becky shops not because she is frivolous, but because shopping gives her a temporary sense of control, pleasure, and transformation. Each purchase holds the promise of becoming a better version of herself. Kinsella leans into this psychology with warmth rather than judgment. Becky's debt collectors are literally personified as letters that shout at her from the mailbox, red ink screaming like an accusation. The comedy is visual, but the feeling underneath is very real. Avoidance, dread, the low-level panic that sits in the stomach when something important is being ignored. Instead of turning Becky into a cautionary tale, Kinsella lets us sit inside the discomfort with her, laughing not at Becky, but with her. As the series unfolds, one of its quiet achievements is how it evolves without losing its core. Becky does not suddenly become sensible and cured. Growth is messy, partial, inconsistent. She learns some lessons, forgets others, repeats patterns, adapts them. This mirrors real change far more honestly than a neat redemption arc ever could. In Shopaholic Takes Manhattan, the setting expands, but Becky's internal landscape remains familiar. New city, same temptations, bigger dreams, bigger risks. The fantasy escalates, yet the emotional mechanics stay grounded.
Kinsella is particularly skilled at using consumer culture as a backdrop rather than the point. The designer labels, glossy shops, and aspirational lifestyles are never the true prize. What Becky really wants is reassurance. She wants to feel that she belongs in the world she admires, that she isn't pretending, that she hasn't missed a secret lesson everyone else learned. This is why the books resonated so strongly at the turn of the millennium, a time when credit was easy, optimism was high, and the idea of having it all was marketed aggressively to young women.
The humor in the Shopaholic series is often described as light, but it is carefully engineered. Much of it comes from timing and escalation rather than jokes. Becky's lies grow slightly larger each time, just enough to remain believable to herself. One small omission leads to another, then another, until the situation becomes absurd. Yet Kinsella always grounds these spirals in emotional logic. Becky lies because telling the truth would collapse the fragile story she is telling herself. This is comedy built on empathy.
Another key ingredient is how Kinsella writes female friendship. Becky's relationships with Suze and others provide contrast and relief. These women are not perfect foils. They have their own flaws, blind spots, and insecurities, but they function as anchors to reality. Through them, Kinsella gently suggests that connection, not consumption, is what actually sustains us. And yet she never turns this into a moral lecture. The books trust the reader to feel the difference.
As the series continues, Becky's world widens into career, marriage, motherhood, and entrepreneurship. Each new role introduces fresh pressures and expectations, and with them, new forms of self-doubt. What's remarkable is how Kinsella manages to keep Becky fundamentally the same person while allowing her circumstances to change. Becky as a mother is still Becky. Becky as a business owner still negotiates with herself. The fantasies shift, but the emotional rhythm stays consistent.
This consistency is one reason readers stayed loyal across so many installments. Becky feels like someone you know, someone you've grown up with, someone who embarrasses you sometimes, but whom you would defend fiercely. Kinsella understands the power of familiarity, especially in comforting fiction. Each book promises not surprise, but recognition. You open it knowing roughly how it will feel, and that is precisely the appeal. It's also worth noticing how gently subversive the series is in its portrayal of ambition. Becky is not driven by status in the traditional sense. She doesn't want power or prestige for their own sake. She wants freedom, expression, and enjoyment. Her ambitions are emotional rather than hierarchical. This makes her an unusual protagonist, especially in a genre that often equates success with external markers. Becky's wins are internal, moments of honesty, small acts of courage, choosing connection over avoidance. Kinsella's language plays a huge role in this intimacy. The prose is clean, conversational, and rhythmically reassuring. Sentences often mirror thought patterns, looping and doubling back, capturing the way the mind chatters when it's trying to justify something. This makes the books exceptionally easy to read, but also deceptively sophisticated. Writing that feels effortless usually isn't. The Shopaholic books also arrived at a moment when women's interior lives were becoming more visible in popular fiction. Alongside authors like Helen Fielding, Kinsella helped normalize the idea that women's anxieties, contradictions, and everyday struggles were worthy of center stage. Not as tragedy, not as moral failure, but as material for humor, warmth, and connection. And perhaps that is the secret dream world the title gestures toward. Not the fantasy of endless shopping, but the dream of being understood without having to be improved first. Becky Bloomwood doesn't ask the reader to admire her. She asks the reader to recognize themselves. In doing so, Sophie Kinsella created not just a best-selling series, but a companion for millions of readers navigating money, identity, and adulthood with imperfect grace.
As we move forward from the world of Shopaholic, it becomes clearer how this voice, this emotional intelligence, and this deep respect for the reader's inner life would shape everything Kinsella wrote next. The shopping bags may fade slightly into the background, but the questions remain the same. Who am I trying to be? Why do I want what I want? And what happens when fantasy and reality gently collide?
As Sophie Kinsella moved beyond the Shopaholic universe, something subtle but important began to change. The humor stayed, the warmth stayed, but underneath the familiar sparkle, her story started to carry a quieter emotional weight. The shopping bags were no longer center stage. In their place came questions about memory, love, self-perception, and the stories we tell ourselves to feel safe in the world.
Many of Kinsella's standalone novels follow a similar emotional architecture. A woman begins in a state of mild chaos, not dramatic chaos, but the kind that hums in the background of everyday life. A job that doesn't quite fit, a relationship that feels slightly off, a version of herself she performs rather than inhabits. Then something happens, a disruption, a lie, a misunderstanding, a secret, or a moment of loss that forces the character to look more closely at who she is and what she actually wants.
In Can You Keep a Secret? This disruption is literal confession. On a turbulent flight, the protagonist spills her most private thoughts to a stranger, believing she will never see him again. The comedy is immediate, but the emotional hook runs deeper. The book plays with the idea that honesty feels safest when there are no consequences, that we long to be seen, but only when we believe we won't be judged or remembered. Kinsella uses humor to explore vulnerability, showing how intimacy often begins accidentally, in moments where control slips away.
Similarly, Remember Me revolves around memory loss, but not in a gimmicky way. When the protagonist wakes up without recollection of the past few years, she discovers that the life she has built does not feel like her own. The novel gently asks a disarming question. If you don't remember becoming someone, are you still that person? And if the version of you that others see doesn't align with how you feel inside, which one is real? These are big philosophical ideas, wrapped in lightness, never heavy-handed, always accessible.
Kinsella's skill lies in her refusal to dramatize these questions. She doesn't frame them as crises. She frames them as awkward, slightly uncomfortable recognitions. Moments of, oh, the kind that arrive quietly while brushing teeth, commuting, or lying awake at night. This is where her writing feels especially attuned to modern emotional life. She understands that many of our deepest reckonings happen not in grand scenes, but in private pauses. Romantic relationships in Kinsella's books often function as mirrors rather than solutions. Love interests are not there to rescue the protagonist, but to reflect her patterns back to her. Miscommunication is frequent, but rarely cruel. Instead, it highlights how easily we project fears onto others, how often we assume rejection where there is none. Kinsella writes romance as a space of learning, not completion. Happiness is never guaranteed by finding the right person, only complicated in new and interesting ways. There is also a growing tenderness in how Kinsella writes women's self-talk. The inner monologues become less frantic, more self-aware. Still funny, still flawed, but increasingly capable of reflection. The characters start noticing their own habits. They catch themselves mid-spiral. They begin to question the narratives they've been repeating. This doesn't mean they stop making mistakes. It means they start recognizing them sooner.
Work and ambition remain central themes, but again, not in a conventional sense. Careers in Kinsella's novels are often unstable, improvised, or slightly absurd. They involve office politics, creative compromises, and the quiet fear of being found out. Imposter syndrome runs like a soft thread through many of her stories. Characters worry that they are pretending, that everyone else received instructions they somehow missed. This anxiety is treated with humor, but also with compassion. Kinsella doesn't mock it. She normalizes it.
What's particularly striking is how often her protagonists are good at what they do, even when they doubt themselves. The problem is not incompetence, capable. They are learning how to believe that they already are. As her readership aged, Kinsella's writing aged with them. The stakes became more internal, but also more poignant. Love, friendship, and work are no longer just sources of comedy, but of quiet grief and adjustment. Expectations collide with reality. Lives don't unfold exactly as planned. And yet, the tone remains fundamentally kind. Even disappointment is softened by humor. Even loss is approached gently.
This emotional maturity becomes especially evident in the way Kinsella handles disappointment. Dreams don't always come true in her books, at least not in the way imagined, but something else usually emerges in their place, a truer version of self, a more sustainable happiness, a recalibration rather than a triumph. These endings don't shout, they settle. Throughout all of this, Kinsella maintains a deep respect for her readers. She never assumes they need to be shocked or dazzled to stay engaged. She trusts them to find meaning in small moments, a conversation that lands slightly differently than expected, a realization that arrives too late but still matters, a decision that isn't perfect, just better. By this point in her career, it's clear that Kinsella's real subject has never been shopping, romance, or even comedy. It has always been the inner weather of ordinary women, the hopes they carry quietly, the anxieties they manage daily, the small negotiations they make between who they are and who they think they should be. Her books offer not escape from reality, but a softer way of inhabiting it. And then, just as readers had settled into this familiar emotional rhythm, Sophie Kinsella would take a turn that few expected, one that would deepen her work in a profoundly personal way and invite readers into a much more vulnerable conversation about memory, identity, and the fragility of the self. As Sophie Kinsella's career moved forward, that vulnerable conversation about memory, identity, and the fragility of the self did not arrive as a rupture. It arrived as a soft recalibration. Nothing in her writing suddenly turned dark or heavy. Instead, there was a gradual shift in emphasis, a sense that the stories were becoming less about navigating the external world and more about negotiating one's internal narrative. The question was no longer only how to succeed or how to be loved, but how to remain oneself while life quietly reshapes expectations. In novels like I've Got Your Number, Wedding Night, and My Not So Perfect Life, Kinsella continued to explore the familiar terrain of work, relationships, and modern pressure, but with an increasing awareness of how performative these spaces can become. Characters are often trapped not by circumstance, but by the versions of themselves they feel required to maintain. The polished professional, the agreeable partner, the person who seems to have it together. Comedy arises when these masks slip, but the emotional core lies in the exhaustion of wearing them in the first place. What Kinsella captures with remarkable precision is the gap between competence and confidence. Her protagonists are rarely incapable. On the contrary, they are often intelligent, resourceful, and emotionally perceptive. Their struggle lies in trusting those qualities. They second-guess their instincts. They defer their own discomfort. They assume that friction means failure rather than information. This internal hesitation is written not as weakness, but as a learned behavior, shaped by social expectations and quiet self-surveillance. Workplaces in these novels become small laboratories for identity. Offices are places where people rehearse versions of themselves, often unconsciously. Kinsella uses satire to expose the absurdity of corporate culture, but she is less interested in critique than in emotional impact. What does it cost to constantly edit oneself? What happens when the effort to appear successful begins to erode the pleasure of actually being competent? These questions are never framed as grand dilemmas. They emerge through moments of awkwardness, misalignment, and quiet frustration. At the same time, Kinsella's romantic plots evolve. Love is no longer a prize at the end of chaos. It is a dynamic space that requires negotiation, honesty, and a willingness to be seen imperfectly. Misunderstandings still occur, but they are increasingly rooted in avoidance rather than misunderstanding alone. Characters fear disruption. They fear asking for too much. They fear discovering that what they want may require change. Romance becomes less about spark and more about sustainability. One of the most interesting developments in this phase of Kinsella's work is her treatment of self-deception. Earlier novels often played this for humor, with characters spinning elaborate internal justifications. Later novels still contain these moments, but they are observed more gently, almost tenderly. There's an implicit understanding that self-deception is often a form of self-protection. People lie to themselves not to avoid responsibility, but to delay pain. This framing creates empathy without excusing harm, a balance Kinsella manages with quiet skill.
Friendship also takes on a deeper role. Friends are no longer just comic side characters or sources of advice. They become witnesses, people who see through the performance, sometimes before the protagonist does. These relationships are not idealized. They contain irritation, distance, and misalignment, but they are grounded in shared history, in the permission to be less impressive. Through them, Kinsella reinforces one of her most consistent themes, that being fully oneself is rarely something we achieve alone.
As time moves forward in her bibliography, there is also a growing acceptance of limitation. Not everything can be optimized. Not every desire can be fulfilled simultaneously. Choices involve loss, even when they are right. This is a significant tonal shift from the early, more elastic worlds of possibility. Yet it is never presented as resignation. It is presented as clarity, as the relief that comes from no longer pretending that everything is endlessly adjustable.
This clarity becomes especially apparent in how Kinsella writes about ambition. Success is no longer framed as arrival, but as alignment. Characters begin to ask not whether they are winning, but whether they are comfortable in the life they are building. There is a growing emphasis on values over validation, on internal coherence over external approval. These are subtle shifts, but they accumulate, creating a body of work that feels emotionally attuned to readers moving through their 30s, 40s, and beyond.
Importantly, Kinsella never abandons humor as she explores these themes. Laughter remains a primary tool, not as distraction, but as lubricant. It allows difficult recognitions to slide into awareness without resistance. Embarrassment becomes a gateway to honesty. Irony softens defensiveness. In this way, comedy continues to function as emotional access rather than avoidance.
Around this period, readers also become aware, gently and without spectacle, that Kinsella herself is experiencing changes that influence her perspective. This awareness does not shift the tone toward gravity. Instead, it seems to sharpen her focus on what feels essential. The writing becomes slightly more spacious. Scenes linger a little longer on moments of connection. Internal monologues gain a reflective quality, as if the characters are listening to themselves more carefully. Memory, in particular, becomes a recurring undercurrent. Not memory as loss, but memory as anchor. Characters think about who they used to be, not with regret, but with curiosity. How did I get here? Which parts of me were chosen, and which simply accumulated? These questions are not framed as crises. They are framed as invitations to reassess, to realign, to forgive earlier versions of the self for not knowing what could only be learned by living. There is also a noticeable gentleness in how Kinsella approaches uncertainty. Earlier novels often resolved chaos through decisive action or revelation. Later novels are more comfortable with partial answers, with endings that feel settled rather than solved. This mirrors a broader emotional maturity, both in the writing and in its assumed readership. The books no longer promise that everything will work out perfectly. They suggest instead that it can work out well enough, and that this may be sufficient. This evolution does not alienate new readers. On the contrary, it creates multiple entry points. Someone can pick up a later novel without having read the earlier ones and still feel welcomed. The voice remains open, conversational, inclusive. There is no insider knowledge required, no canon to master. This accessibility is part of Kinsella's enduring appeal. Her work does not demand loyalty, yet it often inspires it. What emerges, looking across this middle to late phase of her career, is a portrait of a writer increasingly interested in emotional sustainability. How do people live lives they can remain inside without constant self-correction?
How do they soften their relationship with themselves? How do they stop mistaking discomfort for failure? These are not questions with dramatic answers, but they are questions that shape daily experience.
In a literary landscape that often rewards intensity and transformation, Kinsella's commitment to steadiness feels almost radical. She is not interested in breaking her characters open. She is interested in helping them fit more comfortably within themselves. This distinction matters. It reflects a worldview in which growth is incremental, compassionate, and ongoing, rather than explosive or redemptive.
By the time readers reach the end of these novels, the feeling is not exhilaration, but reassurance, a sense that life's complexity can be managed with humor, honesty, and modest courage, that it is possible to adjust course without erasing the past, that being human, in all its contradiction, is not a problem to be solved.
This is the emotional ground on which Sophie Kinsella's later work stands, a ground that is stable, forgiving, and quietly attentive. From here, the conversation naturally deepens further, not by becoming heavier, but by becoming more distilled. Less about doing more, and more about holding on to what matters.
From this point in her work, Sophie Kinsella's writing begins to feel increasingly distilled. Not simpler, but more precise, as if the stories are clearing away excess noise to make room for what lingers. The humor is still present, but it no longer rushes to reassure. It trusts silence. It allows moments to breathe. There is an understanding that some emotions do not need commentary to be felt. One of the most noticeable shifts is how time operates in these later novels. Earlier books often moved quickly, propelled by momentum, mishaps, and escalating misunderstandings. In contrast, later narratives slow down, scenes stretch, internal moments are given as much space as external action. This change mirrors the way time itself can feel as life progresses. Less urgent, perhaps, but heavier with meaning. Kinsella captures this sensation without ever naming it, allowing readers to recognize it intuitively. The protagonists in these stories are still navigating modern life, but they are no longer racing to catch up with it. Instead, they are trying to locate themselves within it. Work is still demanding, relationships still require effort, but there is a growing sense that the central conflict is internal alignment rather than external achievement. Characters begin to ask quieter questions. Am I living in a way that feels true? Am I listening to myself? What would happen if I stopped performing competence and allowed it to simply exist? Kinsella's treatment of success becomes particularly nuanced here. Achievement is no longer framed as upward movement. It is framed as stability, as the ability to inhabit one's life without constant friction. This is a subtle but powerful reframing, especially in a culture that equates value with visibility and growth. Kinsella suggests, gently and persistently, that sustainability is its own form of success. There is also a deepening kindness in how mistakes are handled. Errors are no longer merely plot devices. They are moments of information, signals that something needs adjustment. Characters begin to respond to their missteps with curiosity rather than panic. This shift reflects an emotional maturity that feels earned rather than imposed. Growth happens not because the story demands it, but because the character is ready for it. Memory continues to surface as an important theme, but again, not as loss. It appears as continuity, as the thread that connects earlier selves to the present one. Characters reflect on who they have been, not to mourn it, but to integrate it. Past choices are not rewritten or denied, they are absorbed. This approach lends the stories a sense of wholeness. Nothing is wasted. Even the detours have value. Around this stage, readers also become gently aware that Kinsella's own relationship with memory and presence has sharpened. This awareness does not manifest as confession or explanation. It manifests as attention. The writing pays closer notice to small details, to fleeting moments of connection, to the texture of ordinary days. There is a sense that the act of noticing itself has become meaningful. Importantly, this does not turn the books inward or insular. They remain socially observant, often sharply so. Modern work culture, social media performance, and the pressure to appear fulfilled are all present, sometimes lightly satirized, sometimes simply observed. What changes is the emotional response to these pressures. The books no longer suggest that the solution is to win the game. They suggest that opting out, even partially, can be a form of agency. Relationships in these novels reflect this shift. Romantic partnerships are portrayed as evolving systems rather than fixed ideals. They require renegotiation, honesty, and patience. Love is not diminished by this realism. It is deepened. The characters learn that intimacy is sustained not by intensity, but by mutual recognition, by the willingness to see and be seen without constant correction. Friendships, too, gain weight. They become repositories of shared memory and understanding, places where their performance drops naturally. These relationships are not perfect or endlessly supportive. They contain friction, but they offer continuity. They remind characters who they are when external markers become unreliable. One of the most striking qualities of Kinsella's later work is its emotional steadiness. There are fewer dramatic swings, fewer extremes. This is not because the characters feel less, but because they feel more integrated. Emotions are not emergencies, they are signals. This approach creates a reading experience that feels grounding rather than stimulating. The books do not accelerate the nervous system, they soothe it. This steadiness is especially noticeable in how Kinsella handles uncertainty. Rather than rushing towards resolution, she allows uncertainty to coexist with forward movement. Characters make decisions without full information. They proceed anyway. This reflects a lived understanding of adulthood, where clarity often comes after action rather than before it. As readers reach the ends of these novels, the sense of closure is gentle. Things settle rather than conclude. Questions soften rather than disappear. There is a sense that life will continue beyond the final page, not in dramatic ways, but in small, meaningful adjustments. This open-endedness reinforces the sense of companionship that defines Kinsella's relationship with her readers. Taken together, these later works form a body of writing that prioritizes emotional livability. They ask not how to have everything, but how to have enough. Not how to become someone else, but how to remain oneself through change. This is a quiet philosophy, but a persistent one. Sophie Kinsella's contribution to contemporary fiction lies not in reinvention, but in refinement. She has spent years honing a voice that understands its readers not as audiences to be impressed, but as people to be accompanied. Her books do not promise escape. They offer company. They sit beside you rather than pulling you forward. And in a world that often equates value with intensity, this offering becomes increasingly precious. The ability to remain gentle without becoming trivial, to be humorous without becoming dismissive, to acknowledge difficulty without surrendering to it. These are not small achievements. They are the result of sustained attention, care, and emotional honesty. As the arc of her work continues, what becomes clear is that Sophie Kinsella has been writing the same story all along, from different angles. A story about learning how to live comfortably inside one's own life, how to soften self-judgment, how to accept imperfection without resignation, how to find lightness not by avoiding weight, but by carrying it with kindness. This is the space her books occupy now, a space that feels steady, forgiving, and quietly generous, a space where readers can rest without disengaging, where humor coexists with reflection, where being human is treated not as a flaw, but as the point. From this stage onward, Sophie Kinsella's work begins to feel less like a response to the world and more like a quiet stance within it. The stories no longer push against expectations so much as they step slightly to the side of them. There is a sense that the writing is no longer negotiating permission to exist as it is. It simply does. This confidence is understated, but deeply felt. What becomes increasingly clear is that Kinsella has always been interested in emotional regulation, long before the term became common language. Her characters are constantly trying to soothe themselves, sometimes clumsily, sometimes creatively. Earlier novels explored this through shopping, distraction, and fantasy. Later novels explore it through boundary setting, self-awareness, and recalibration. The methods change,
but the underlying need remains the same: to feel safe inside one's own experience.
This continuity gives her body of work a surprising coherence. What might appear from the outside as a series of light romantic comedies reveals itself as a long-form exploration of how women manage pressure, how they internalize expectations, how they learn, slowly and imperfectly, to release what no longer serves them. Kinsella does not frame this as empowerment in a grand sense. She frames it as relief.
Relief is an important word here. Her later novels often move toward moments of emotional release rather than victory. A truth finally spoken, a performance finally dropped, a choice finally acknowledged. These moments are not triumphant, they are quiet. And that quietness is precisely what makes them resonate. They mirror the real moments in life when something shifts internally, without fanfare, but with lasting effect.
Kinsella's humor adapts to this emotional landscape. It becomes less about chaos and more about recognition. The jokes land not because something outrageous happens, but because something familiar does. A thought you've had but never said aloud, a reflex you recognize immediately. Laughter here becomes a form of validation, a signal that you are not alone in your inner contradictions.
There is also a notable increase in compassion toward uncertainty. Characters no longer rush to label their discomfort. They sit with it, they test it. They learn to differentiate between fear and intuition. This is a subtle but significant shift. Earlier novels often treated discomfort as a problem to be solved. Later novels treat it as information to be interpreted.
This shift reflects a broader emotional maturity. It suggests an understanding that clarity is not always immediate, and that forcing resolution can sometimes distort truth. Kinsella allows her characters to pause, to not know, to change their minds. In doing so, she offers readers permission to do the same.
One of the most quietly radical aspects of Kinsella's later work is her refusal to frame rest as failure. Slowing down is not portrayed as giving up. It is portrayed as listening. Characters begin to prioritize what sustains them over what impresses others. This recalibration is not dramatic, but it is transformative. It changes the emotional texture of their lives.
The books also begin to engage more openly with the idea of limits, not as constraints imposed from outside, but as realities to be acknowledged internally. Energy is finite, attention is finite, time is finite. Rather than resisting this, Kinsella's characters learn to work with it. They choose more carefully, they let go more deliberately. This acceptance brings a sense of steadiness that earlier characters often lacked.
Readers who have grown alongside Kinsella's work often recognize themselves in this evolution. The shift from striving to sustaining, from proving to inhabiting, from urgency to presence. The books feel less like instruction manuals for navigating life and more like companions for living it.
At this point, the relationship between writer and reader feels especially reciprocal. Kinsella trusts her audience to follow her into quieter territory. Readers trust her to handle that territory with care. This mutual trust allows the stories to deepen without becoming heavy. Seriousness is softened by humor. Reflection is balanced by warmth. The world around the characters continues to be busy, demanding, and occasionally absurd. But the emotional response to that world changes. Instead of being swept along by it, the characters begin to observe it with a slight distance, not detachment, but discernment. They learn that not everything requires their participation.
This discernment becomes one of the defining qualities of Kinsella's later voice, a sense of knowing what to engage with and what to let pass, of choosing where to invest emotional energy, of understanding that attention itself is a resource. This awareness feels especially resonant in a culture of constant stimulation and expectation.
By now, it is clear that Sophie Kinsella's enduring appeal lies not in plot innovation, but in emotional accuracy. She writes feelings that people recognize immediately, even if they've never articulated them. She names experiences gently, without pinning them down.
This allows readers to see themselves without feeling exposed. The effect of this is cumulative. Book after book, the reader internalizes a softer way of relating to themselves, a way that values honesty over performance, sustainability over intensity, presence over perfection. These lessons are never stated outright. They emerge naturally through story. As we approach the final phase of this arc, what stands out most is the generosity of Kinsella's worldview. She does not demand transformation. She does not insist on optimism. She offers understanding. And in doing so, she creates space for readers to meet themselves with greater kindness. This is not a small achievement. It is the result of years of attention, restraint, and trust in the power of quiet storytelling. Kinsella's books remind us that growth does not always look like change. Sometimes it looks like staying. In the final view of Sophie Kinsella's work, what remains most striking is not any single book or character, but the emotional environment she has consistently created. Across decades of writing, she has offered readers a space that feels recognizable and safe without ever becoming stagnant. A space where humor is not weaponized, vulnerability is not exploited, and imperfection is not something to be corrected before it can be accepted. This environment matters because it asks very little of the reader. It does not demand aspiration, productivity, or reinvention. It allows people to arrive as they are. In a world increasingly structured around performance and optimization, this quiet permission becomes a form of care. Kinsella's stories do not tell readers who to become. They help them feel more at ease with who they already are. One of the reasons this care feels so authentic is that it has never been rushed. Kinsella did not pivot suddenly into depth or seriousness. She grew into it gradually, alongside her audience. The emotional intelligence present in her later work is the natural extension of questions she has been asking from the beginning. How do we manage our anxieties? How do we negotiate desire and expectation? How do we remain kind to ourselves when life refuses to follow a neat narrative? Even when life introduces new constraints, the writing does not contract. If anything, it becomes more intentional. There is a heightened attention to what deserves focus. Moments of connection are given space. Small joys are treated as significant. The books suggest, without stating it directly, that meaning is not something to be accumulated. It is something to be noticed. Kinsella's relationship with humor also reaches a kind of equilibrium here. The comedy no longer needs to carry the story. It supports it. It lifts moments without overwhelming them. Laughter becomes a companion rather than a distraction. This balance allows emotional truth to surface gently, without resistance. Importantly, her writing never slips into sentimentality. Warmth is not confused with denial. Difficulty is acknowledged, but not magnified. The stories accept that life contains uncertainty, limitation, and change. What they resist is the idea that these realities must strip life of pleasure or meaning. Instead, they suggest that lightness can coexist with depth, and that joy does not require perfection. As readers move through these books, often over many years, they experience a subtle recalibration of their own expectations. Success begins to look less like achievement and more like alignment. Happiness feels less like arrival and more like ease. The pressure to become someone else softens. This influence is quiet but cumulative. Sophie Kinsella's legacy, then, is not defined by genre or sales figures, though both are significant. It is defined by the emotional impact of her voice, by the way her stories make readers feel seen without being exposed, by the way they normalize internal conflict without dramatizing it, by the way they offer companionship rather than instruction. Her books often arrive at moments when readers need rest rather than stimulation. They are picked up on commutes, before sleep, during transitions. They do not compete for attention. They accompany it. This is a rare quality, and one that cannot be manufactured. It emerges from genuine attentiveness to the rhythms of everyday emotional life. In this sense, Kinsella's work functions almost like a long conversation,
one that unfolds slowly, without pressure to conclude. Each book adds another layer of understanding, another variation on familiar themes. The conversation does not end with answers. It continues with recognition.
What remains most consistent from the early Shopaholic novels to the later, more reflective works is a deep respect for the reader's inner world. Kinsella never assumes she knows better. She never positions herself as above or ahead. She writes from alongside. This orientation shapes everything: tone, pacing, resolution. It is why her stories feel trustworthy.
In the end, Sophie Kinsella has written not about extraordinary lives, but about ordinary ones treated with care. She has shown that gentleness can be intelligent, that humor can be generous, that comfort can be earned. Her books remind us that being human is not a problem to solve, but an experience to inhabit.
And if you are listening to this now, perhaps while doing something else, perhaps letting the words drift in and out of focus, that too feels appropriate. Her stories have always made room for that kind of presence, partial, relaxed, unforced.
They do not insist on being remembered all at once. They stay with you quietly, in tone, in rhythm, in the permission they give you to slow down, to soften, to accept yourself without rehearsal.
That is the quiet gift of Sophie Kinsella's work. Not transformation, but companionship. Not answers, but understanding. Not escape, but a gentler way of being where you already are. And that perhaps is more than enough.